Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this last recording for us. Lord willing, next week we will be in person, resuming our Bible classes. That is Sunday, June 6th. As a reminder, we will be continuing the Hebrews class. We will continue this class in the fellowship hall. That'll give us plenty of space to spread out. That'll allow us to really be comfortable enough as we continue on in this study. I hope it's been beneficial. I hope it's been real rewarding for you and has spurred you into a greater study of God's Word. I hope that you are making plans for you and for your family to be part of our Bible classes and our morning assembly, our evening assembly, and our Wednesday night. I hope that you will resume that priority of feeding your faith, being with God's people the first day of the week, joining together on a Wednesday night, and encouraging one another. It is very, very important that we get back into that and start getting back into those signs of life and making those spiritual things a priority for us. Because that's where encouragement is found. That is going to be where we can encourage one another and spur on one another to love and good works. Where we can build each other up by discussing God's Word and learning from each other and learning with each other. Our children can be in Bible classes where they can be having a foundation for their faith, and you can go home and build on the foundation from their Sunday school class and continue to grow their faith and to grow their knowledge of God and God's Word. We're going to be in the book of Hebrews this morning. We're going to be in chapter 6, and we are going to be looking at verses 13 through 20. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 20. I want to take a moment to read this because this is a very familiar passage, very encouraging passage. Glad it's very encouraging. Last week's lesson was needed, but it was very tough. It was something that we needed to hear and to be challenged on. But as the Scripture does, it balances out so well that every time there is a tough and challenging passage, there is an encouraging one to follow, and this is one of those. Let's begin reading with Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, Surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all of their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of His purpose, He guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable truths, or things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the Hebrew writer is going to shift to a certain extent his topic. So last week was about immaturity, how we grow our faith. But one of those questions that always linger is, how do I know that God can be trusted? I am to have faith in God, and I am to believe God. How do I know that God can be trusted with what He tells me? How do I know that God can be counted on and depended on for what He tells me? Whether it's a promise, whether it's a command, how do I know? What is my confirmation to know that God can be trusted in anything and with everything? And this is one of those passages that will answer that question. So the theme, if you will, for this section is that it is the full assurance of hope. The end of verse 11 is that we would have the full assurance of hope until the end. Why? Because hope sees the invisible. Hope is willing to believe that something is real, even though there's not much evidence for it. It's the hope, it's the conviction of things not seen. And that's tied into Hebrews 11 and verse 1 with that definition. What the Hebrew preacher wants us as Christians to have is the full assurance of hope. That says a lot because for those, remember his audience. I say this every time. Remember his audience. They're on the fence. Do we stay with God? Do we leave God? Do we stay in the faith? Do we leave the faith? They are struggling with assurance. They are wondering whether God can be believed and trusted and so many other things. So what the Hebrew preacher is going to do in this section is speak of the nature of hope and kind of how it's grounded in us. And he provides Abraham as an example. Abraham is the example not just of faith, but then also a full assurance of hope. So what is it that the Hebrew preacher uses? Well, he uses God's promise to Abraham as his example of his point. So his point is full assurance of hope. Here's the biblical example, God's promise to Abraham. So the promise is reiterated in here at the beginning of verse 14, saying, "Surely I will bless you and multiply you." That's the promise. Now we know God made more promises to Abraham. If you want to see them, look at Genesis 12, look at Genesis 22:17 that you see on the screen. That's where you will get the full promises of God. So the Hebrew preacher is just kind of condensing that. But the thing that he wants to hone in on, the reality he wants to hone in on, is the fact that God made a promise to Abraham. Now, before we get to God, let's talk about Abraham very briefly. In verse 15, we see something that Abraham never saw the promise fully fulfilled. And I intentionally worded it this way. In one sense, Abraham did see the promise of, "I will bless you, I will multiply you," when Isaac was born. Abraham saw that. But in another sense, Abraham did not see future generations. He did not see anyone who would come after Isaac. He did not see the children of Israel grow into the numerous amount of people that they were when we get to the book of Exodus in the time of Moses. Abraham did not physically see that with his eyes. The only part of the promise he saw physically was the birth of Isaac, which is a whole different lesson, and it shows a great power of faith. So what did Abraham do? Here's kind of a side lesson for us. What did Abraham do in terms of seeing this promise besides believe? Well, notice what it says in verse 15. Abraham patiently waited. A few Sunday nights ago, Brian led us in a discussion of patience or steadfastness, how we need to add to our faith. Patient endurance is the phrase that he used, which is the more accurate word or the way to translate that original word in Greek. To patiently endure. Abraham patiently endured everything that he had to encounter because he saw God's promise. He believed in God, and because he believed, he was willing to patiently endure, patiently wait for that. Now, this patiently wait, if we want to ascribe a time frame to that, Abraham waited 25 years. He was 75 years old when God made his promise. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. 25 years, Abraham patiently waited. Now, here's what's so important about this is that when God makes this promise to Abraham, Abraham and Sarah have no control over the promise of God. God makes a promise knowing that Abraham and Sarah, from a physical point of view, are well beyond their ability to have children physically. The Roman letter tells us in Romans chapter 4 that Abraham's body and Sarah's body, their physical body, they might as well have been dead. They could not physically have children at 75 years old and 50 years old. Their bodies were beyond that. God makes a promise to Abraham, knowing that Abraham and Sarah have no control over that promise. And when Abraham and Sarah try to control the promise, you have the incident with Hagar, and you have the incident when he adopts a son. When every time Abraham and Sarah try to control the promise of God of having a son, things never go well. And that's a reminder for us. Patiently waiting doesn't mean perfectly patiently waiting. Abraham wasn't perfect as he patiently waited. There were times where he got impatient. There were times where Sarah got impatient. When we grow impatient, we end up doing things that bring more harm and create more damage and do things opposite of God. Again, the case in point is when they involve Hagar to have a son on their behalf because Abraham and Sarah grow impatient. We are to add to our faith patience, so that in one hand, we don't end up doing something because we are impatient. I don't have to tell you of all the times when I acted impulsively and I acted impatiently and had to pay a steep price for that on whatever it is. Let's make sure, because our faith is strong, and this ties into last week's lesson, because we are growing and maturing in our faith, it's easier to patiently endure and patiently wait for the promise of God. But if we're immature, immaturity will lead to impatience. That sounds like a sermon to me. Maybe that'll come later. God makes the promise. How does Abraham know that God can be trusted when he and Sarah can't do this? They physically cannot have children. How does Abraham know that God will fulfill the promise? How does Abraham's faith, and by virtue of that, his hope, grounded in that? Well, this is the Hebrew writer's reasons. In verses 16, 17, and 18. You could tie in verse 13 as well to this. The Hebrew preacher mentions reasons for trusting God. First and foremost, it's just the formality of the promise. He mentions something that takes place between human and human when we make promises, and this is just the case. When we make promises, there is a formal, when it's a promise that has powerful ramifications, we go through a formal process. Some of you have bought a home recently. We know the process of buying a home, but we know that there is a certain formality. Papers are drawn up. Responsibilities throughout the process are designated. If you are a buyer of the home, this is what you're supposed to do. If you're the seller of the home, this is what you're supposed to do. If you are the agent, this is what you do. Everybody has a role to play. And when the time comes for that transaction to happen, two things normally happen when it comes to buying a home. You sign the documents, and we know it's a bunch of documents. Sign here, date here, and it's a refrain. Sign here, date here. Sign here, date here. We are putting our names down on a legal document that says we will pay, this mortgage payment. And you're talking with the lender and everything else. But in addition to that, there would be a deposit made, a down payment, something for good faith. Whatever it is, we know money is attached to that. The same works when we buy a car. When we are making promises in this world, there is a process that we go through in terms of the formality of the promise. God adopts that. Now, I'm not saying He adopts that because humanity's figured out the best way, but God understands that He's got to communicate the promise and answer the question on why He can be trusted to us as human beings. Because we are by nature going to be untrusting. Trust has to be earned. In God should be trusted, but God also knows that we're going to have that struggle. So He makes a formal promise to Abraham. And it's acknowledged in verse 13 that when God made a promise to Abraham, since he did not have anyone greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. God understands Abraham needs a down payment. He needs my signature on this promise. I'm promising him a son, and I'm promising him future generations. Abraham needs that collateral. Abraham needs that evidence. But God could not go and find somebody greater than him to formalize that promise. So when we are going through a house buying process, there's a lawyer involved who is greater than us for the state of North Carolina that acknowledges this person will be held to that promise. There is no such person for God. God cannot go over to a lawyer or an angel or an archangel or whoever and say, I need you to verify this promise. God cannot do that. There is no one greater than God. So what He does is He uses His name as collateral. I swear by my name. That's the formality of the promise. God makes, the way that I could describe it, God makes a legal contract with Himself. God binds Himself to the promise. And He uses His name as the down payment and the signature of that promise. That says a lot. Think about God's name. We are not to take God's name in vain. We are not to treat the name of God as a mere happenstance. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, is how Jesus teaches us to pray, the disciples' prayer in Matthew 6. God's name throughout the Old Testament. One of the reasons why He would not destroy the nation of Israel when they would go down their path of sin is because He wanted to preserve His name. God uses His name with Abraham and says, Abraham, I will do this promise, and here's my evidence. I swear by my own name. I swear by my name that I will fulfill the promise. This is your evidence. When God does this and He makes the promise, the Hebrew preacher says this at the end of verse 17. He guaranteed it with an oath. So verse 17, when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise, when He wanted to go the second mile and make sure beyond a shadow of a doubt He could be trusted, God put that promise on an oath in His unchangeable character. And the result of it in verse 18, two unchangeable things. And that's this. God makes a promise, that's it. He makes a promise. A promise of God is an extension of His character. And that character that is behind that promise is the reality that God cannot lie. God cannot tell a lie. Satan is who he is because all he does is lie. God is who He is because all He does is tell the truth. He does this. Abraham, I swear by my name. That's the one. That's the formality of the promise. And here's how you know you can trust this promise, because I don't lie. I don't lie. We will be lied to in the blink of an eye in this world. Somebody will have no issue lying to us. But there is one person who will never tell us a lie, and that is God. And if I know that God will never tell me a lie, then whatever He promises, whatever He commands, whatever He teaches, whatever He reveals in His Word, I can always trust. From the day that I am baptized for the forgiveness of my sin, to the day that I die and go from this life to the next, and every day in between, God will never tell me a lie. And the Hebrew writer says that is so powerful and so important, because here are your reasons for trusting God. And he's telling the audience, if you leave, you're sitting on the fence, and you don't know whether to be faithful or whether to abandon the faith. If you straddle this fence and you ultimately leave, you need to see what's happening. And two things happen. So if you're straddling the fence and you ultimately abandon, there are two things that happen. One, you are telling God that He cannot be trusted. And two, once you get out from God, you will not find anyone else who will always tell you the truth. God is the one person who will always tell us the truth. You leave Him, you will be around people and messages that will have some sort of underhandedness. Whether it's half a truth, whether it's a white lie, it doesn't matter. To leave the faith is to leave truth. And as you're walking out the door, it is communicating to God, you cannot be trusted. So I'm going to leave. Think about that. I know we don't think about it from that perspective. When we stay with the faith, no matter how hard it is, we are telling God, I don't understand, it's hard, but I know you can be trusted. And I know you can be trusted because you don't lie. Sometimes we need to stay in the faith based on those two realities and use those as a foundation for us to be able to move forward. So notice the results. If we do this, if we stay with the faith and continue to maintain the reasons for trusting God, here is what is born. Here's what is produced out of that. Verses 18, 19, and 20. You get a full assurance of hope, you get strong encouragement, and you get an anchor for the soul. You get full assurance of hope. Full assurance of hope is found in the fact that God makes a promise and He cannot lie. God can be fully trusted and He cannot lie. We will always have a full tank of hope because God can be trusted and He cannot lie. And I use the word full tank because at the time of this recording, there's a worry that we are not going to have gas. There's a gas shortage, and everybody's looking at their gas tanks, and we need to go and look and try to get as much gas as we can just in case there's a shortage. There will never be a shortage of hope as long as we know that God can be trusted and He cannot lie. We will never run short of that. And not only would we have that hope, but we would have encouragement, and I love the adjective, we would have strong encouragement. Strong encouragement. Encouragement is the ability to put courage into someone that doesn't have any. That's what it means to encourage. I'm placing encouragement into someone. I'm placing courage into someone. It takes courage for us to continue to move forward and to walk by faith and not by sight. God, because He cannot lie and because He can be trusted, provides not just encouragement, but strong encouragement for us to continue in the faith. And when things happen to us, bad things happen to us, tragedies happen to us, unspeakable hardship happens to us, hope and strong encouragement, because God cannot tell a lie, and because God tells the truth, because He can always be trusted, no matter where we are, we will always have an anchor for the soul. And that's great. I must say this. All of these, for us as Christians, are found in Jesus. Jesus is the reason we have a full assurance of hope. Jesus is the fulfillment of every promise God has ever made or will ever make to us. And just as we can trust God, if we are Christians, we can trust Jesus. That's why we are to look to Jesus as the author and the finisher of our faith. And that's why he ends this chapter and this section, that Jesus is the one who enters into, this is verse 19, the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as the forerunner on our behalf. Why? Because Jesus knows what it's like to struggle with hope. He knows what it's like to struggle with discouragement. He knows what it's like to be battered and bruised. He knows this because in Hebrews 4:14 and following, we have a high priest who sympathizes with us and in every respect has been tempted like us, but yet without sin. We have Jesus. This is important as I close this. I don't want to assume this any time that I teach. This is why it is so important that for those of us who may be listening to this who have not responded to the gospel and put faith and trust into Christ and have been baptized for forgiveness of sin, it is imperative that we do that. Because all of these blessings are only found in one place, and one place only, and that is in Jesus. You want full assurance of hope? You want strong encouragement? You want an anchor for the soul? You got to be in Jesus. And the only way to be in Jesus is to be baptized into Christ. That's Galatians 3 in 25 and 26. Majority of us here probably have already done that. If you have, go back and reflect on what Jesus has done for you at the cross. Have full assurance of hope, strong encouragement, and an anchor for the soul. God has promised. Church, God has promised. He can be trusted, and He will never, ever lie to us. Thank you again for joining us. This is our last recording for our Hebrews class. I hope that you will make plans to join us on Sunday, June 6th. We will pick up with Hebrews chapter 7, so you want to be ready for that. Be reading chapter 7. If we need to review, let me know, and I have no problem using one of our classes to review. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out. Let me know. I would love to hear from you. Until then, I hope that you have a great day. Bye-bye.